So a warm welcome to you all watching this live, to the guests and to the speakers. Welcome from the Early Years and Primary Phase Committee to GeogLive 21, Decolonising Primary Geography. If you're wondering where the image is from, I took that image in the United Nations General Assembly shop over in New York. Fascinating to see all those world flags. So do put in the chat if you're watching us live where you're from, where in the world. We are recording this and we will post this on YouTube later. We do recommend that unless you're a speaker, you turn off your camera. That does help save the planet, apparently, and you'll be muted as well throughout unless you want to chat and speak later. We do love you asking questions in the chat. We do love you putting your thoughts and feelings in the chat as well as we go through, but particularly afterwards, do tell us what you thought in the chat or tweet us at EYPPC_GA. Lots of people are behind this session. I'm Anthony Barlow and I'm supporting this session today as the host, but otherwise there's lots of people who help support the GeogLive sessions. So just remember at the beginning that our contributors are sharing their ideas, their work, their learning, their research today. So if you are going to use this in other contexts, we'd really love if you acknowledge the source that you got the ideas from. So you are welcome to use the material, but do acknowledge that it's from GeogLive and acknowledge that it's from these individual speakers. Copyright resides with them. So what are we doing today? Well, we've got a number of different things. We're going to have an introduction shortly from Dr. Tessa Willey on the Primary Geography Journal. Then we've got our first session from Dr. Fran Martin and Francisca Rocky, and they're going to share their thoughts on this theme of decolonising geography in the primary curriculum. Then we've got Dr. Evelyn Corrado and Favor, who are going to be talking on similar and complementary themes, following on from Fran and Francisca. And we've got a great book list from colleagues Sally and Sophie as well. And as ever, we're supported superbly by the EYPPC committee and Julia and Steve and Kate. So thank you very much to them. But like I say, use the chats, talk to each other as we go through. This shouldn't be a monologue. This should be a dialogue that we can have both live and afterwards as well. And just to share on the screen as we start, we've got these books, these primary texts that you might want to refer to, these primary texts that you can have a look at, and there's a QR code there, and I'll flash these back on the screen at the end as well. But we'll move straight on to Tessa. She's going to tell us a little bit about the latest issue of Primary Geography Journal.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you everyone for being here today. Great to see you and absolutely delighted to be having the opportunity to introduce our new and latest Primary Geography Journal, which should have just landed on your doormats and in your inboxes. So this is on a focus on curriculum making. So it's the summer 2024, and Dr. Paula Owens has done a wonderful job of collecting and editing a number of really key articles on the subject of curriculum making and related to that. There's some really useful advice on starting out with curriculum making and thinking about sort of unpacking some really important details about curriculum making. And there's also a very, very handy glossary of terms to be used with curriculum making, sort of unpacking as well a bit about the difference between disciplinary and substantive knowledge, thinking about things like sense of place, pedagogical approaches, inquiry, and so on. So it's a really useful glossary, which I know many of you will come back to use. We've got a really important article on values as well, and remembering to include this vital aspect of our planning when we're considering what to include in our thoughts around designing the curriculum, and that is values. Also considering different pedagogical approaches, and as we all know, one of our real key pedagogies is through the use of inquiry, and so how inquiry can lead us in curriculum making. So some really useful ideas there. Mapping, of course, such an important consideration when we are doing anything to do with planning and considering how to help children's learning and develop that. So we've got really effective use of planning and how to embed that, as well as the use of digimaps. The Early Years and Primary Committee have done a subgroup of theirs, has done a wonderful article on how to embed quality geography in your planning and thinking about what makes quality geography. So I really commend that to you to read. Well, I do all of the articles, of course. And there's a wonderful one as well on wildlife restoration, looking at wildcats in Scotland, which is just a fascinating account of how this is done and how that can be incorporated in your curriculum. Two other articles looking very much at agency and how we can develop agency in our planning, of including agency within our planning. One through art and looking at an artist in residence and how that can be used. And the second one, which is using promoting the free online professional development materials from the UCL's Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, which looks at the role of geography in helping children to understand climate change and sustainability education, and developing the concept of the citizen geographer, and thinking about how we develop agency through that, making them critical learners and making informed decisions about various things. So that's just a taster. I leave it to you to discover and explore the rest of the journal, which I think you'll agree is wonderful. If you haven't received it, please do let us know. I'll put my address in the chat. We are always looking for authors. We're always looking for people to contribute to Primary Geography Journal. Please do get in touch with me. And I'll put my email address in the chat, and our senior production editor. These are some as well. We have got not articles, but these are articles, but relating to our theme on the GA website. We got two, and I'm delighted to see Evelyn's here this evening, which is absolutely brilliant. We are absolutely showcasing your article there in the Changing Geographies Primary Geography Journal, Decolonising Geography to Unshackle the Representation of Africa. So absolutely fascinating, really important article there. I really recommend that. And then we've also got Fundamental British Values, Geography's Contribution to Understanding Difference, from Fatima and Fran. So we've got Fran here too. So we got two of our authors in previous editions of Primary Geography, which is wonderful. So please do look at the website as well. Lots of resources on there available related around these themes. So yeah, I think, Anthony, that's it from me for this evening.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Tessa, and the whole team that put that together. And just to link as well to our theme, we've had previous GeogLives where we've had Evelyn talk. We had GeogLive 13, which was about teaching place local to global. You can link to that via this QR code. We had contributions from Jen, who's also here today, on the A word, worth watching that. All these are for free, found on YouTube. We had contributions from Chantal in Montreal, in Quebec, and I gave some thoughts on Ofsted and component parts. So that was one GeogLive. We had GeogLive 14, which was about place. Again, you can access this for free via the link. We had Sophie, classroom teacher there, along with Leslie and Simone, thinking about teaching place, how to start topics with open minds, all sorts of collaborations and connections to what we're talking about today. Again, Jen talking about her friends planning and teaching there, in teaching the continents, particularly perhaps year 1, year 2, key stage 1 thinking. And I talked a little bit about Egypt through a geographer's eye. So just some other things, kind of curriculum focused, practice focused, that you might want to have a look at. Just one final thing before we move to our first speakers, just from a personal perspective, as we've been putting this together and preparing this. There's 3 QR codes on the screen to 3 different articles that I've seen in recent weeks that have really made me think. So I just want you to have a moment of thinking before we kick off. What about the last plant that you saw, the last plant that you named, maybe the last plant that you taught to a child? Is there possibly a colonial perspective there? I was really taken with this article I saw the other week, where Banu Subramaniam said that Cecil Rhodes, as a historical figure, is commemorated in the names of 126 plant species. Is that right? Should that be corrected? You may have a view on that. She certainly does, because she argues that plant taxonomy was a colonial project. The impulse to create a universal plant set of names was necessary for empire, because it gave a way of identifying and mapping the spoils of the worlds. The colonialists wanted to know, was the nutmeg plant here the same as that plant there? So plants, pieces of art. Do you look at pieces of art? Do you share pieces of art with your children? Is there a colonial perspective there? Again, an article that I saw from a artist, an older artist called Gavin Janches. He said that there's now a rush, too much of a rush perhaps, to correct the record of what's been collected, because in his view, many Black artists from the 70s and 80s were ignored. Is that right? Are you doing that in your curriculum? Are you wanting to feature more diverse artists? And then finally, the books. We've got a book list, really useful book list today. Again, looking at an article that I saw very recently when we've been preparing for this. I don't use Book Talk, I don't use TikTok, but there's this star called Jack Edwards who's very influential on what people read. And he has said, he's in his 20s, he has this mission since graduating to decolonize and diversify his bookshelf, whether that's through working closely with the Women's Prize or expanding his knowledge on books written by trans authors or by people experiencing the diaspora, or perhaps reading books in translation. He's reflecting on how his history GCSE and A-level never touched on colonialism, and that is, as he calls it, insane. So he's constantly thinking, how are reading lists for students curated? Who is curating them? Because he's saying that he should be educating himself, because he's got this position of power. So that's just my opening thought. There may be similar, contrasting, discursive things to link to that, but I don't want to say any more, because I want to give our guest speakers who've generously shared their time as much time as possible. So a really warm welcome to Fran and to Francisca. Thank you very much for being with us, and I'll pass straight over to you.
Thanks, Anthony. Francisca and I put our heads together. We met a couple of times, and we're just going to sort of do a double act. If we can go then to the first slide, and you'll see by the title, a relational approach. And I'm asking you just to sit there and think for a minute about your relationship with colonialism, and how that might or might not have shaped your identity. What I would like to suggest is, or what we suggest is, that actually we are all, literally every single one of us in one way or another, in relation with coloniality and colonialism. And because of this, depending on where we are in the world, that relationship will be different, and it will have helped to form our identities. So this will come through our histories, this will come through our geographies, where we're located, it will come through our connections to land, the way in which we act as citizens, the cultural contexts that we exist in. And in the next slide, I'm going to just say one or two things about some of the myths about decolonizing, and I actually think this applies to any aspect of education, but obviously we're focusing on geography today. One of the myths is that it's about curriculum content and avoiding single stories. Another is that it's about diversifying whose knowledges are included in the curriculum and the teaching resources that are used to support that. And I know that Francisca is going to say something about that in a moment as well. And there's another myth that it's about how we teach about distant places. And whilst it is each of those three things, it is also about other things, which, if we move forward, they should reveal underneath the line there. So yes, it is about curriculum and diversifying and teaching about distant places, but it is also about the structure of disciplines and disciplinary knowledge, the ways in which we know about things. It's also about our relationships with the colonial past, hence the previous slide. It's also about its legacy in the present and its continuation in the present. And it's also about understanding our entanglement, therefore, with that present and coloniality. And we use the term coloniality to distinguish it from colonialism and colonization, because it's the legacy, the way of being in the world that's been left behind.
So just following on then from what Fran has said, something that we both mutually agreed on the next slide,
Anthony?
is decolonization, sorry, not being a metaphor. So this is something that I wrote whilst I was at university, and doing some research on the geographies of wildlife and decolonization. And I came up with the quote that decolonization is not to be confused with diversification. Decolonization requires more than equity and inclusion, and diversification can still exist within a Western bias. The aim of decolonization is to deconstruct research that has preserved epistemological colonialism. So Fran's are going to go through the alternative ways of being, knowing, and valuing. And then later on, we'll move on to how primary texts that we use reinforce some of these colonial ideas.
Thanks, Francisca. So if we go to the next slide, in this slide, it looks as though I am setting up a binary, but actually I'm not. What I'm doing is I'm saying that there are two broad ways or traditions of being, knowing, and valuing in the world. And on the left-hand side, there's an object-based tradition. And I've highlighted it in blue because we're going to look at the influence of this on the primary curriculum, national curriculum documents in a moment. And object-based traditions tend to have a relationship with the world where the knower is the subject and the things being known are the objects. And it's a form of sort of doing two. It's a bit like the who names things that Anthony mentioned a little bit earlier. And then an alternative tradition is a relational tradition. And a relational one is one that sees the knower as a subject, but the known also as subjects with agency in their own rights. And so the way of being there is a being with, a form of knowing where you are being with subject to subject, or subject with subject, rather than subject to object. And I'm going to look at those in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. So first of all, object-based ways of knowing. They are based on what we're calling a logic of separation. And that is because when things exist as objects and are seen as separate from the knower, a way of knowing is developed based on a binary hierarchical system of classification. So again, it's about this naming things, putting them into groups, and understanding the way in which we classify or categorize things in the world. And I've got a sort of a tree classification image on the left there, just to show what that looks like. And you can see that as you classify and you think, is it this or this? Oh, it's that. So it goes off in that branch, and then to a smaller branch and to a smaller branch. And it is continuing to separate and separate and separate. And in these forms of separation, categories are usually understood in curriculum terms to be bounded and static. So you develop a piece of knowledge and now you know it. And it's acquired through all sorts of ways. And it is usually understood as things that can be objectively measured and verified. And there's another, if you just push forward, there's another thing there we go. So under the object-based ways of knowing, that tradition, a question might be, how can we categorize the world? Things that we look at in the world, things that we are investigating in the world. And because the knower is the one who categorizes, or because they have previously been categorized and we just learn what those categorizations are, they tend to be from a single perspective. So if we move on to the next slide, relational ways of knowing are built on a logic of interconnection. So here, as I said earlier, there is a logic of interrelation, of interconnection, of interdependence, where the subject is relating with another subject, whether it's a human subject or an other than human or more than human subject, and trying to understand that relationship. And through looking at the differences that might be evident between the subjects, one comes to know oneself better as well as to know the other better. So in this way of understanding, things exist, but that knowledge can't be separated from the knower and the subject of the knowledge. Again, these things are constructed through the senses, cognition, intuition, but also, and very importantly, we can add to this knowledge developed through emotion, knowledge developed through spirituality, through connection, interaction, and so on. And so from this perspective, things can't be verified objectively necessarily, because you need to look at the context, the situation within which that knowledge is known and understood, which brings in the idea of multiple perspectives and plurality. And again, if we just press forward, the question for a relational way of knowing might be, how does what I know relate to what you know? How does who I am relate to who you are? And so it's a conversational, interdialogic co-creation of plural knowledges. Thank you. So the blue represented the object-based ways of knowing, and the yellow represented the relational ways of knowing. And what I've done here is I've just taken the National Curriculum for Geography Purpose of Study, and you can see that I've highlighted some key words here that indicate both object-based knowing, knowledge about, knowledge of significance, that's significant to who, and relational, interconnected, interdependent, changing over time, etc. So if we look at the National Curriculum for Geography Purpose of Study, you can see that both ways of knowing are evident there. However, if we move to the next slide, which shows, and I've just taken place knowledge here, and it shows place knowledge statement for Key Stage 1 and place knowledge statement for Key Stage 2. And all of a sudden, the relational ways of making sense of the world, of knowing and being in the world, have disappeared. And this is all about setting things up as things that can be categorized, and then within those categorizations, drawing similarities and differences between them, contrasting them, and putting them almost in opposition to each other.
So, geographies of wildlife then. So this area of geography concerns the relations between humans and non-human animals. And it's an opportunity for geographers to call into question the conventional places of animals in cultural and geographical studies, and to push us towards a manner of study in which there's a contrast between human and beast and how it's undermined. So just looking at some of the books that are on the slide, we've got The Tiger Came to Tea, which I know is used quite a lot in primary. This potentially is more early years primary, My First Animal Book, The Big Five, Say What, etc. And something that we see in these texts is some of the Big Five. And discussions that Fran and I had is about how we develop young people's relationship with animals and how they view the African continent or the Asian continent, and then what connections they make to those places and the people that exist in those places. So do they see it as a place that only exists for animals, and then using words such as wild or uncivilized to describe those animals, and therefore go on to describe humans that live in those spaces in the same way. And we also identified that this is done through things that children would wear as well. So we can see some Lion King pajamas on here at the top and at the bottom. And some of those ideas are also reinforced through clothing that's aimed at young people. So things like on World Book Day, when we're encouraging students and pupils to wear, come and dress their favorite book, what ideas are we reinforcing through characters and characterization and for plays, etc. as well. And there's a really good paper on this by Garland, which talks about how we set up the way in which we view the African continent, and how people view human beings who are from the African continent or who live on the African continent. And then the language that we use to describe those people as well. And often people don't see them as humans. They use the language to describe them as non-humans. And I will also share the link to that article because it's really good. I really recommend reading it. Next slide, please, Anthony. So I came up with a way for geographers to decolonize, specifically for the geographies of wildlife, but I think it can be applied more broadly. So I came up with 3 stages. So geographers should address, review, and action. So the first stage was addressing. So this stage was addressing that it was a necessary first step. And there needs to be an acknowledgement of the wrongdoings and decolonization of the mind from colonial ideas. And Fran has touched on that earlier. So in this stage, I had proposed that geographers should ask themselves if they're ready for decolonization. So is this something that you actually want to do, or is it something that you feel you need to do, or feel like you have to do? Because all of those are very different feelings and emotions, and it's something that we should be doing. So it's not a case of you feel like you have to, or I guess that feeling of being forced, that shouldn't be what the process is. It's something we have to do to make sure that our discipline improves, and also we don't continue reinforcing colonial ideas. So the end goal of this stage is a complete removal of domination and a power that has left those who embody colonization to feel inferior. And then the next stage then is review. So once geographers have accepted that decolonization is a necessary step toward better geography, a process of review should follow. So this review process is where we can take a selection of work from the colonial and post-colonial era, and work that is approved for submission. So thinking about journals or textbooks or children's books, etc. And revisiting work that has already been produced as well, and looking at work that's been cited the most, not just in geography, but sub-disciplines and related disciplines as well, and assessing whether it aligns with the conditions of a decolonized curricula. And then lastly, then action. So moving forward, ensuring that all new productions of work follow a set criteria. And this criterion should be uniform across the discipline and sub-disciplines, and aim to continuously decolonize both our minds and institutions that uphold colonized curricula. So really encouraging us all to look at what we're using currently. Should we really be using this going forward? And then what can we do to improve what we're using, but also decrease the amount that we're relying on these ways of knowing? For example, I'm sure a lot of people use Charles Darwin in conversations to do with evolution, biogeography, etc. But there are loads of other people from the same era who are not reinforcing colonial ideas, of which I have given some recommendations later on. Back to you, Fran.
Yeah, thanks, Francisca. So I think what we're saying is, yes, it's about the resources we use, but it's so much more than that. It's about how do we think about the world? How do we position ourselves in the world? What sorts of questions do we ask? And as I hope we're demonstrating, it's as much a state of mind on the part of the teacher that affects the way in which you teach, as it is about am I diversifying my resources? What books am I using? So on the left-hand side here, just to sum up, the object-based ways of thinking, knowing, being, and valuing, the subject-to-object relationship tends to be a monologic one, and questions might be geographically, how do I or pupils relate to people, places, and phenomena that are listed in the national curriculum? How do I or pupils relate to each other and the human and more than human worlds? How do we relate to geographical phenomena, culturally, economically, historically, socially, and so on and so forth? So those are all legitimate geographical questions to ask. But so also are the ones on the right-hand side. Anthony? So all I've done here is I've asked exactly the same set of questions, but I've replaced to with. And I would invite you just to have a look at those and think about how does that make a difference to the way in which you think about what you might be teaching when you put with instead of to. How do I and pupils relate with people, places, and phenomena? How do I and pupils relate with each other, the human and more than human worlds, and with geographical phenomena, culturally, economically, historically, and socially? And it's that withness, that interconnection, interrelation that is so important and that is so often missed out. And yet that's part of the decolonial approach. Francisca?
And next slide then, please. So Fran and I have put together.
Oh, sorry, just pass through that. Yeah. Your slide is more important.
So Fran and I've put together some resources. There's some on the previous page, and this one was more linked to what I said. So there's Geographical Thought, which is a module that I did at university with Professor Pauline Cooper. There's It's a Continent by Astrid, which is a really good book talking about the fact that Africa is not a country and it's a continent and all the histories that exist within the separate countries that make up the continent. Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks, a really good one for the practice of freedom within education. Paulo Freire for Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a really good one for all educators actually, not just geographers. And a more recent book by the Black Curriculum, which talks about places and Black people's present in different places, either in the continent of Africa or outside of the continent of Africa, and around the world, and what presence they've had in different places. So I think this one's a really good one for geography, actually, not just for Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 1, but also Key Stage 3, 4, 5, and beyond. And I've also linked the journal article by Garland, which is called The Elephant in the Room, Confronting the Colonial Character of Wildlife Conservation in Africa. And if you're not able to access it, then please send me an email. I'll leave my email either in the description with Anthony, or you can email GeoLive to get it. I'm happy for anyone to contact me, and some books and some podcasts, and some other useful links. I think Decolonising, Decolonised Geography Group are amazing, and they've got loads of free resources on their website as well, and they share quite a lot on Twitter. So yeah.
Thank you, Francisca. Thank you, Fran, for your contributions and for your wealth of different things that we can look up. You've certainly made me think. Do colleagues put things in the chat if you want to discuss any more? As Francisca said, she's happy to share an email if you want to chat further. It'd be really good to see if you can use any of these ideas in the classroom, or if you're actually trying things out. I think that first of the 3 stages, Francisca, was a really important thing for me to think through. Are you ready for this process? Are you willing in this process? Are you somebody who's being forced into this process? Is this just the latest thing? I think that is the risk sometimes, and I know that I've had that in my practice sometimes. It's the latest thing on the agenda for us to look at after the previous thing.
Thank you for having us.
Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for the effort and the preparation. So like I say, carry on the conversation through the chat. Any feedback, any comments, do please let us know. There may be time for questions at the end. There may be time for comments on the recording, but otherwise we'll move straight on to Favour and to Evelyn. Thank you, both of you, for sharing your thoughts on this theme as well.
Thank you, Anthony. And it's continuing the conversation when we are rethinking the representation. Representation, mostly we say it's socially constructed. It's a generalized conception of others that seems to be constructed and acceptable. But as Fran has said, and Francisca, it's mostly attributes that shows the difference between us and others, and sometimes, or most of the times, is prejudicial, which comes probably from colonial attitudes. And because my work focuses on Africa, is rethinking how Africa is represented. But since we are speaking about teaching praise, it's thinking not just about our curriculum, but also thinking about our pedagogy and practice. So as they have asked us, are we ready to deconstruct the knowledge that we have about places and work with the people who come from the continent of Africa or who have the heritage of Africa, so that we can represent a more balanced outlook in our practice, in our pedagogy, and also in our day-to-day life. So that's what I'll be trying to challenge you to start thinking about. So in the next slide. So it's more thinking about the single stories, about the representation of Africa. I look at this because I grew up in Africa, and I didn't know it was as bad as when I stepped out of the continent and I had all these stories, and I was like, wait a minute, that's not my experience. And that's when I started feeling like, okay, this is not right. It needs to be challenged, and I've tried to challenge it in my work, and I'm really grateful that Geography Association has given me space to continue to interact in this. So what we need to think of is more about the historical representation of how our curriculum, our practices. As in UK, we inform or we share knowledges about the continent with our students, because this is important for their own knowledge, but also for the children and the people we work with who are from the African continent, who need to be, it's important for them to have their stories of their heritage represented in a more balanced way. So it's important that we start challenging those dominant discourses that are negative, that are misrepresentation of human beings who probably sometimes they are not aware of how their stories are presented. When we look at geography, when you think of the human geography, I was thinking of the cultures and identities and history of the African people. And if I focus especially on my country, Kenya, I noticed as I started interacting with other people, and that was when actually I used to work at an airport in Kenya, at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, and everyone used to ask me whether I'm a Maasai. So I was really surprised, because Maasai is a very small community, and Kenya has around 40 communities. So this is a community that lives in a nomadic way, but it seems that outside the continent, it has become the identity of Kenya, where we overlook all the other experiences, the realities of the other 40 communities, because there is a discourse that is being ingrained about Kenya. They are backward, they are still living in the bush, and they haven't moved on. And actually, I challenge, there is nothing wrong with living a traditional lifestyle, but still it is a single story that seems to form the image of Africa and or of Kenya, actually. I remember the other day I was speaking to someone and they said, oh, where do you come from? I told them I'm from Kenya. They said, oh, I know about animals in Kenya. And I was telling my husband that there are also people, there is 60 million people also in the country of Kenya. So you can see the knowledges and those interactions. Although I can make fun, it's quite insulting to the people who are being presented. So it is important that these cultures, we reflect on how dominant discourses has been programmed, maybe even in our own discourses and also in our own interactions with the people from the African continent. When we look at physical geography, there is that need to have those diverse representation, whether it's vegetation, it's climate, it's resources. And in my paper, I was saying like some people think most of the continent is desert, is a desert, which it's not. So that diversity, we have mountains, we have vegetations, we have different resources. And when you look at even countries like Egypt and Sudan, we see that presentation of pyramids and deserts, which overlooks the other resources that we get from those countries. When you go to Sainsbury's, you buy fruits from Egypt, you buy oranges. We have resources. Some of our oil, the petrol we use from Shell, we get it from Sudan. But those things, we overlook those stories. And maybe that is why when in our teaching place, we need to have space to discuss, to reflect, and to discuss this with our students so that they can be aware of these constructions that are prejudicial, that we need to be able to challenge in our discourses, in our curriculum, in our work as well. When and also the books we use. I was using this book here. It's my son's book. It's Planet Earth. And it's a very nice book until I reached some pages and I realized some of the photos that are used, if it's in the Western context, we bring the best people, the people who are the astronauts, the smart people, as you might call them. But when we present other places in Asia, in Africa, the photos that we use are maybe people digging a well somewhere, people starving, or people probably being carried away by the terrains or whatever. So I really felt bad, although I bought this book for my son and we were going through the book, and at some point I thought, oh gosh, here are the photos again. And so as educators, we need to be able to challenge those representations. We need to be able, when we are writing our research, when we are writing books as well, even the books we are using, sometimes we are able to have those discussions with the students. Do you think this is how people in probably South Asia look like? Do you think this is what percentage of people do you think are like this? So also having those, when we are discussing about their experiences, their politics, their economies, their lifestyles, when we focus, I'm using an example in each of these. And I'm just thinking about Rwanda. I recall even the debates we see on TV, and people saying the Rwanda and the genocide. That's all we seem to know about Rwanda and the genocide, and obviously with the politics, whether we should deport people to Rwanda or not. And children in our classes, they see these things. So it is important that we have these discussions, because when the story of Rwanda is being told, we are only focusing on the genocide, but people of Rwanda, the Rwandans have moved on. There is reconciliation. they have developed and they have moved on. But the story we are always telling is always about the Rwanda, but we just, the way it's also projected is like these people who just wanted to kill each other, but also we leave out what were the conditions for them in the country to do this, and also what was our participation or the outside world participation in the genocide. So, and what was our response? How did 1 million people get killed when we were still watching? And probably it's not just that. Right now we can start thinking about people still dying in Congo, in Gaza. What is our position as educators and when we are representing the geography as well? So it's important to bring these stories to life in our class, in our pedagogy, and link them, and also create space for that dialogue with our colleagues, with our students, so that they can have that critical consciousness of spaces, of human geographies, of physical geographies, and of social geographies. And just to bring it to light, the next slide, I would like Favor, who's a master student, has kindly accepted to read for us this article by V.B. Nyavanga Wainaina. He wrote about how to write about Africa, and I think this will bring it to life, how Africa is perceived outside the continent. Thanks, Favor.
All right, thank you, Dr. Eva. I'll get right down to it. How to Write About Africa by Biavanga Wainana. Always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. Subtitles may include the words Zanzibar, Maasai, Zulu, Zambezi, Congo, Nile, big, sky, shadow, drum, sun, or bygone. Also useful are words such as guerrillas, timeless, primordial, and tribal. Note that people means Africans who are not black, while the people means black Africans. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book or in it, unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. An AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts, use this. If you must include an African, make sure you get one in Maasai or Zulu or Dogon dress. In your text, treat Africa as if it were one country. It is hot and dusty with rolling grasslands and huge heads of animals and tall, thin people who are starving. Or it is hot and steamy with very short people who eat primates. Don't get bogged down with precise descriptions. Africa is big, 54 countries, 900 million people who are too busy starving and dying and worrying and emigrating to read your book. The continent is full of deserts, jungles, highlands, savannas, and many other things, but your reader doesn't care about all that. So keep your descriptions romantic and evocative and unparticular. Make sure you show how Africans have music and rhythm deep in their souls and eat things no other humans eat. Do not mention rice and beef and wheat. Monkey brain is an African's cuisine of choice, along with goat, snake, worms, and grubs, and all manner of game meat. Make sure you show that you are able to eat such food without flinching, and describe how you learn to enjoy it because you care. Taboo subjects, ordinary domestic scenes, love between Africans unless a death is involved, references to African writers or intellectuals, mention of school-going children who are not suffering from yaws or Ebola fever or female genital mutilation. Throughout the book, adopt a subtle voice. In conspiracy with the reader and a sad, I expected so much tone. Establish early on that your liberalism is impeccable. and mention near the beginning how much you love Africa, how you fell in love with the place and can't live without her. Africa is the only continent you can love. Take advantage of this. If you are a man, thrust yourself into a warm virgin forest. If you are a woman, treat Africa as a man who wears a bush jacket and disappears off into the sunset. Africa is to be pitied, worshipped, or dominated. Whichever angle you take, be sure to leave the strong impression that without your intervention and your important book, Africa is doomed. Your African characters may include naked warriors, loyal servants, diviners and seers, ancient wise men living in Hamitic splendor, or corrupt politicians, inept polygamous travel guides, and prostitutes you have slept with. The loyal servant always behaves like a 7-year-old and needs a firm hand. He is scared of snakes, good with children, and always involving you in his complex domestic dramas. The ancient wise man always comes from a noble tribe, not the money-grubbing tribes like the Gikuyu, the Igbo, or the Shona. He has rheumy eyes and is close to the earth. The modern African is the fat man who steals and works in the visa office, refusing to give work permit to qualified Westerners who really care about Africa. He is an enemy of development, always using his government job to make it difficult for pragmatic and good-hearted experts to set up NGOs or legal conservation areas. Or is an Oxford-educated intellectual turned serial killing politician in a servile rose suit. He is a cannibal who likes crystal champagne, and his mother is a rich witch doctor who really runs the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Favor. Thank you so much for reading that. And there's lots more. If you go on the link on the previous slide, you can see the rest of that powerful piece from Granta. Clearly not all appropriate for primary children, but if we think about the images that we see in the media about African nations, many of those things are very, very evocative. Back to you, Evelyn.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I believe that makes you start to think what we see in the media, what we see in charity campaigns, and even in our books as well. Most of our books, even for children books, sometimes the pictures of the children, we see the representation, even what we tell the children in our classroom when we are giving charity aids to help children in Africa. The stories that we tell, that you guys are good here, let's help those poor children in Africa. So instead of speaking and critically thinking about moving away from politics of pity to politics of justice, thinking about why are they where they are? As Francis and Francisca said, the coloniality, how has coloniality impacted where some of those countries or some of those communities are, and how can we be activists for justice instead of politics of pity or politics of aid. So it's important that we have a critical consciousness on how other spaces or other people across the globe are represented. And Freire stated that to be human is to engage in relationships with others and with the world. It is to experience that world in an objective reality, independent of oneself and capable of being known. The world that is inclusive, that respects other people's experience, knowledge, and allows their participation in representation or in engagement of whatever we are representing about them. And as educators, our pedagogies, curriculum, and practice should be able to foster learning that is grounded in lived experiences through allowing participation and inclusion of the people we are trying to teach about, Right now we have technology, we have global people. We are very integrated, so we can always see people and talk to them about their lived experiences. We have parents, teachers, colleagues from diverse backgrounds. So including them in our practices is important. Hearing their own voices is important. I just did a study with African parents to know about, to listen to their voices about their experiences in UK schools. So their participation, our attitudes towards the families and engaging those parents and communities is important. Also, it is, as educators, it's important that we create spaces where we encourage critical thought and consciousness on our representation of others. This is through the books we use, our daily discourses, as I said, the charity campaigns and how we present that for our schools, for whatever we are doing in our research, in our teaching, and also in our leadership. So as I conclude, I argue that one of the purposes of education is moral leadership. And hence, we have a responsibility to make a difference in our practices and we should try not to reproduce the recurring misrepresentation or misconceptions about others in our knowledge, in our discourses, and in our practices. We should aim to create spaces for critical dialogue, for reflection, and also for progress. As Professor Wangari Maathai stated that in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground, a time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other. And that time is now. And I'm encouraged for the work that geography teachers are doing. And I'm hopeful that you're making a difference in your places of work. Thank you.
Evelyn, thank you so much. Favor, thank you so much as well for sharing your perspectives and sharing your perspectives at quite short notice as well. Thank you very much. You've given us all an awful lot to think about. So thank you very, very much. Please do use the chat for comments, for questions, to share information. We are wrapping up very, very shortly. If anybody's got any particular questions, we will come to your questions shortly. My GeogLive colleagues will come to those and we'll perhaps have a moment or two to share those. But I'm just going to share the slides that have been really carefully prepared by Sophie and Sally. More book resources that primary colleagues, early years colleagues might want to use across the primary phase. Great text there. If you've got any other ones, please put them into the chat. All sorts of different perspectives represented there, particularly from the African continent. So thank you very much for preparing those. The QR codes will take you to a Google Doc and you can download those slides for yourself. All sorts of different things there, including that book there from the Black curriculum called Places, Important Sites in Black British History. Definitely on my book recommendations, those. So thank you for those. Just a reminder that GeogLive 22 is coming up in September. That's going to be on effective subject leadership. Maybe you've got something you can share. Do contact us via the Twitter X site that you've probably got this information from. Do email the group. We'd love to have your perspective shared. If you've got anything that you'd like to trumpet in your schools, what's working for you, what's effective in terms of your subject leadership. A reminder that the back catalogue of GeogLive perspectives are available, all 21 hours now of CPD on a whole wide range of subjects. And a reminder that we'd love you to be a member of the GA, a free primary member. Just Google it, you can find out about that. or a member who can gain access to GA News and to the primary geography journal as well. We'd love you to sign up and join the growing band of 10,000 plus members of the association. So those are the formal slides. Thank you for joining us. If you need to head off, some of you will. Tummies will be rumbling. Lots of wonderful thanks in the chat box. I just wonder if there's anything else that anybody wished to raise from the GeogLive group before we just finish the recording. I haven't managed to track the chat myself.
No, Anthony, there's no major questions. Basically, lots of people are saying how much they've enjoyed the session.
Thank you. Fran, just one question for you, if I may just put you on the spot. Certainly, Francesca and you talked about power and aligning the conditions to create these decolonized curricula. Is there one straightforward thing that you would say that you could start with if you're ready for this journey, if you're ready to do this? Is there a place that you could start? Because you mentioned in your presentation that it can be about single stories and thinking about that. It can be about looking at your bookshelves and the books that you've got, but it's more than that. Is there a simple place that you would say that primary teachers could start?
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot. Okay. I would say, for me, it started with my own education. And that was not a quick process. I read lots. I began to, and because I was in a work relationship with Fatima, who is a transnational Ismaili Muslim living in Canada, but that's not the place of her birth, and also with somebody who is a First Nations scholar in Canada, that made it, because we were three people in relationship working with each other, it made a huge difference to how I understood myself in relation with coloniality and the ways in which I was unconsciously colonial in what I did, how I did it, how I thought about it. So it was my own education that was the starting point.
Thank you. So I suppose the message there is not to do it on your own necessarily. You could do it with.
That's why we called our talk a relational approach.
Excellent. I've got the point finally. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Really wonderful to have you along. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.